Before I ask a question, I'm just interested in how many people here have had an experience of coming out at work, and I'm going to ask how many have had an experience where they felt it was actually a good experience, that once they did it, they felt glad, and how many felt they had a bad experience? Just if you've had a coming out experience at work and you felt it was a good experience, just let me see your hand. And those who feel they came out at work and had a bad experience. That's very interesting. So the overwhelming majority, and that is my own experience. It's the difficulty of, it's the sort of internal pressure to stop saying stuff that's the problem, rather than the external pressure in a lot of cases. It's the walk through the door rather than what happens on the other side of it. I mean, John, just how did your experience affect your work? Because you see, in some ways, I could see you being, with this double life you were leading, working very hard and putting everything into the job and actually being, in some ways, more productive as a closeted gay man trying to make a career. It was your baby, it was your family, it was everything, and there was nothing else.
And I think I had to prove a point because there was nothing else, Evan. And I think that's the point. I mean, it can be done, and I think I did dedicate my life to my work because there wasn't actually anything else there. And that's, I think, probably not good in the long run. I think it creates a very unbalanced life and unbalanced person. So I feel much better now that I can actually have a portfolio career which includes a real life.
Yeah, and I mean, I said that you discovered your life. I mean, just to reiterate, you were forced out by this blasted newspaper who published all this stuff about you, and the guy who gave them the story. But in terms of your personal well-being, no comparison.
No comparison at all. I mean, obviously I had to reconcile myself to my new life. You know, I was 59 when I was outed, right? So you can't suddenly say, fine, I'm outed, brand new life, you know, pick up and go. You have a moment where you have to let go of your old life, pick up your new one, and understand quite what the advantages were. And they were enormous. I mean, in the end, of course, I ended up having a great partner who I still have as the love of my life. So it was just an extraordinary event.
Yeah, a walking advert for the whole experience. What was BP like for, I mean, did BP, it was your company, or not your company, but you were running it, did it have a kind of diversity policy, or had you thought, oh, I mustn't talk about diversity, because then people will think I'm gay?
I actually created a very important diversity policy, I think. Most people would say I recruited a great diversity and inclusion manager, an African-American woman who arrived at St. James headquarters, and she worked directly for me. We made a lot of changes. I went off to a diversity forum in 2002. I gave a speech which included things like, well, we're going to give benefits to gay couples, so in order to attract them. The very next day, the headlines in the Guardian newspaper, which for those of you not from the UK, is what you might call on the socially responsible liberal side, and their headline was, BP chief to recruit gays. That was their headline. So that certainly did worry me quite a lot, I'd say.
Right. The book has been a success. Do you feel now, and we're going to really, for this first part of the afternoon, relate to this topic in terms of large international companies like BP or IBM, do you think the BPs of this world are receptive to the message of the book?
I think very large companies are, with some exceptions, but it depends therefore on, you know, where they're headquartered. But actually very large companies are, and they have the means whereby to invest in the change in culture and the systems and the backup to get this done. And it's not just companies, it's big institutions like World Bank, IMF, for example, IFC, they're doing a lot. So I think the movement is certainly happening. My book was designed on several levels. One is companies, but I said to myself, you know, my satisfaction would be if this affected an individual. And actually, I do get people come to me and say they read the book and they decided to come out, and that, to my mind, is as important.
You're going to get a chance to ask some questions because I'm going to invite another couple of speakers to come up and relate their experiences, perhaps in less detail, but to talk about what their companies do. We're focusing on the big companies. One last one, Lord Brown, and I'll be interested to hear how it is here in Prague and in Czech Republic. But my experience at the BBC is that when I arrived there, which is 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, when I arrived there, the subject wasn't really much talked about. There might have been a bit of gossip about somebody or somebody else, but it wasn't much talked about. And I think it was a liberal environment. I don't think there was any homophobia. It wasn't negative. And I think BP wouldn't have been negative in your, or not very.
Depends which
some
years, I'd say.
yeah. But what I observe now is there is a huge generational difference. So the people who are 20 years younger than me, who are working at the BBC, everybody knows everybody's sexuality as far as I can tell, and there's no stigma, there's much less shame. There seems to have been an enormous change generationally.
I think probably over the last decade has been the biggest change, I'd say, and it has many manifestations, things like equality of marriage, for example. But, before then, I would say homophobia, no, but lack of respect, yes. There was, I tell a very funny story about, one of the chairmen of BP who went to New York speaking to a friend of mine who's married to another friend of mine, they're lesbian and straight man. The chairman of BP used to refer to the marketing department as British pansy because he felt that most of the people in marketing were gay. That was a typical sort of story. Very, very different now. BP's very different, of course. Got plenty of senior gay people. But I do think, if I may, one thing. I believe very positively the glass is half full. But I think, like all things to do with minorities, constant vigilance is needed. This is not my phrase. It's a guy who's on the Court of Appeal in the UK, who's a gay judge, been out for a long time. His line is, when I interviewed him, as I was walking out of his chambers, that's his office, he said to me, I just think you need to remember constant vigilance is needed. And I think he's right.
Let me invite our next two speakers to come up and join us on the stage, if they would. We have two speakers from big international corporations. Jean-Michel Monod, who's head of diversity at Sodexo. Jean-Michel, welcome. And also Claudia Brind-Woody from the United States, Vice President and Managing Director for Global Intellectual Property and Advanced Technology Licensing at IBM. So two very large companies. Claudia, tell us a little bit about IBM and its experience. And we're focusing for this first part, as I say, on the larger companies and the kind of the benefits that they perceive or fail to perceive of diversity and inclusion. Claudia.
We're really fortunate at IBM that it's in our DNA. Early on, we had leaders, our senior executives, Thomas Watson, Senior Thomas Watson Jr., our CEOs, who back in 1953 had our first non-discrimination policy. Yes, and back in the late 50s and early 60s, we had an experience where we were asked to come and build big manufacturing plants in the states of North Carolina and Kentucky in the US. And at the time, the law in those states was that the blacks and whites had to have separate toilet facilities and drinking fountains. And we said, we're not coming until the law changes. And the law in both of those states changed, and we built two of our biggest manufacturing facilities in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Lexington, Kentucky. We had equal pay for equal work for women before it was mandated by law. And our non-discrimination policy for sexual orientation was in 1984. So we have a history of respecting the individual that we're very proud of. We've worked very hard in the LGBT space to try to make a difference in the world. One of our values is innovation that matters for IBM and the world. So we take that very seriously. And along the way, we've been able to make a difference, whether it's by sponsoring the sessions like this in places that are moving up what I would call the maturity curve on LGBT rights, or helping places like the US get it right when it comes to marriage and some of our non-discrimination in the workplace policies.
Tell us about your own story.
My own story.
Let's get personal.
All right. Well, I was very fortunate to come into IBM as a professional hire. So I came in as an out lesbian. They knew me and I knew them from the Atlanta Olympics. I was one of the directors of the results system that had IBM, Swatch, Xerox, and Scientific Atlanta, and they kept bugging me till I came to work for IBM after that. But I was able, and in fact, I was the number 3 out executive in IBM. We have 44 now. And I'm one of the global co-chairs. But I've had a really good experience. I've been very privileged at IBM. I think one of the most telling stories, personally, is that in 2011, I married my partner, who happened to be a Brit. And we married in New York because it was legal in New York. But at the time, the Defense of Marriage Act was still in force in the US, and she could not move to the US. She works for Citibank, another big company, and she could have moved to the US with her company, but IBM said, you know, it doesn't matter. You run a global team, it doesn't matter where you sit. We'll allow you to move to the UK. So I immigrated to the UK, and I'm now an IBM UK employee because of that policy of tolerance and inclusion. So I feel very privileged to work for IBM.
Yeah, and to the benefit of the UK, which is a point that John Brown mentioned, that the recruitment struggle for top talent around the world is saying that you don't want certain categories of people is not a good way to raise your batting average, to raise your average employee productivity. Jean-Michel, tell us a little about Sodexo, because I, until this morning, didn't know. You've got like hundreds of thousands of employees. You're as big as IBM. Tell us a little about the company and its diversity policy.
Yeah. Just before that, I would like to thank my co-panelist, Lord Brown, the First Lady you recruited as Chief Diversity Officer, is a member of our board.
I know.
So thank you for that. She's a great one. And Claudia, the first time we had to talk on LGBT at the group executive committee, we decided to invite somebody from the business, just to convince our leaders that it was not only the last good idea of the CEO of the guy in charge of DNI, and we invited somebody from IBM. So very happy to be with both of you for that. So Sodexo, yes, we are a huge employer for more than 20,000 people in 80 countries, which means, by the way, that if we trust statistics saying that 6 to 10% of the world population is either LGBT, we may have between 25 and 40,000 LGBT people. The question being where are they? We deliver quality of life services, and delivering quality of life services for our client means that firstly, we need to deliver quality of life for our employees, which means being inclusive. And I would love to say that it's obvious, that it's natural, that it's part of the DNA. I don't know anybody, any company having DNA totally open to diversity and inclusion, because that's not the way we are raised. So, as a service company, we have to, and I want to build on what you said about engagement. That's really, we know that to be performant, to deliver, to have a good profitability, we need to have engaged people. That's why we're extremely committed to D&I. We do a lot, not enough. So we are progressing slowly, far behind you in terms of LGBT, because we started 8 years ago, you started 30 years ago. But we are trying to run behind you.
I'm going to ask for questions, experiences, or points from the floor. We're going to get you to put them into the microphone. You can put them in English if you prefer, more comfortable in Czech. I know we've got some translators up here, but so be thinking of that. I'm going to just have another couple of questions here, but I do want you to contribute. So just be thinking of your points, and we'll get microphone moving to you. I just want to ask the question of the two of you who's still working in large corporations as to, if I asked you in 4 sentences to say why you believe in diversity, can you answer that? Jean-Michel first.
Because we have to. There is no choice. And if I focus on LGBT, first thing is we have to mitigate risks. It's not always said, but when I'll take the map of the world map of LGBT rights, and if I match it with Sodexo map, I see that 14% of our workforce, so 60,000 people, work in countries where they can be legally persecuted. I think we have a responsibility. And you may know a lot of these countries, Lord Brown. So that's one. Second one is of course engagement, and I don't want to take too much time on that, but it's really key, and it's the way for us to explain to our leaders why they have to be committed to all kinds of diversity, including sexual orientation. It's because everyone knows that having engaged people drives performance, and our managers have a bonus on their ability to engage people. And as you said, it's not possible to feel engaged if you don't feel included. And feeling included means feeling safe, feeling respected, and feeling valued. So that's the second thing, engagement. And the third thing is about business. We have 75 million people, they use our services every day, which compared to, I don't know, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, or Apple is probably ridiculous. But the 75 million people, they use our services, they see our people, they interact with our people every day. And if our people are not respecting others because they are a woman, because they are gay, because they are old, black, or whatever, that's a major issue. On the contrary, if we are known as an open company, if we take consumers' needs into consideration, if we respect them, that's a key measure of, that's a success factor. And our clients are companies such as BP, IBM, or all kind of companies. And more we see that these companies want to do business with other companies sharing the same values. So it makes good business sense. And that's a good way to engage our managers, by the way, to say, if you don't trust me, because I'm the guy at headquarters managing D&I, trust your clients, ask them. And I recently updated our business case, which aims to explain to non-experts why it is a business issue. And I took a lot of logos from companies having LGBT networks or being officially committed. It's impressive. And I did the same work some years ago, and I had to admit that I struggled to find non-British or non-American companies. Now you can find, which is really new. So there is a business imperative. And even we get now listed in the list of gay-friendly companies, and it creates a competitive advantage.
Claudia, I actually said in 4 sentences. Jean-Michel, that was fine.
Each sentence was a bit longer. But there are 4 sentences.
4 sentences.
Claudia, why?
As a global company, by definition, we are diverse. We have diverse cultures, old, young, black, white, gay, straight, people with disability, every diversity you can imagine. So the question is, are we going to take advantage of it? or not? Are we going to leverage the power of the innovation that diversity brings or not? And that's the inclusion. That's the inclusion part. We could be, all white male making decisions and not accessing the diversity, or we could choose to access it. And everything you said in terms of our people, our clients, and our business growth are part of that equation.
I saw on Facebook the other day a little video that had gone viral. I don't know, it was actually in Sweden, which is a very progressive country. It was somebody who did an experiment on an employer of sending 2 candidates for a job. And one, at the end of the interview, sort of asked a question and said, "My boyfriend and I," so obviously in a very subtle way, just coming out and making clear that he was gay. And the other one was a hopeless candidate, absolutely hopeless. And they were just contrasting the experience of the two, because the one was a useless candidate, the other was a good candidate, but the good candidate was gay, and you saw the employer recoiling, really just turning against the gay candidate. Did any of you see that video? Have you seen it? Okay, we'll look it up. It's a sweet, did I see a hand go? It was actually, it's just a kind of fascinating and almost a bit shocking, just to see it there with a secret camera looking at the employer. But I do think the recruitment, that the big brand, the image of a company is not just around the kind of the branding of the products. There's a sort of a bigger aura that sits around a company, and there's definitely a kind of a warmer feeling about some companies than other companies. And if you can get that, then people do seem to want to work for you more. And when they get there, they maybe work better for you as a result of that.
Yeah, and I'd like to comment on that, if I may. One of my favorite stories about IBMers recruiting talent was at an MBA recruitment seminar for LGBT MBAs. And one of our executives kept seeing these Asian women come by all day long, picking up the IBM brochures and going through the conference. And so finally, toward the end of the day, he stopped one of them and he said, "Look, all day I've had Asian women come through, and I know you're not all lesbian. Why are you here?" And they said, companies that get LGBT, because it's the hardest, if they get LGBT, they get women, they get Asian, they get other diversity. And that was the key indicator for them, that that company was a good company to work for.
And Evan, just on your little video, it's actually backed up by a very large academic study where people did actually put in very controlled experiments around the world on CVs that had a connotation of gay, CVs that didn't. And always the connotation of gay lost.
And then similarly with race, incidentally, if you they've done it with sort of names that are more common among the black population and the white population, and you can send the same CV, and the white one tends to get more pickup. Just want to ask you quick, before I open to the floor, Claudia, why do you have a recruitment process or a drinks party for LGBT recruits?
We do it for all diversity. So we believe that we want the best talent wherever we can find it. So we have special recruitment for women and for blacks out of our traditionally black universities in the US.
But why don't you just have a recruitment drinks party or recruitment drive? I mean, why do you still, given that you're 30 years down the road, 50 years, 70 years down the road of this being an inclusive company, why do you have to still categorize people?
Because diversity matters. We still have recruitment for engineers that's different from our recruitment of MBAs, that's different for our recruitment of people in our communications functions from the journalism school. Every aspect of diversity matters, and being able to segment those aspects and value whatever that part of diversity is, whether you're an engineer or an accountant, we think that's important.
Right, I'd really like to hear from the floor. Now, we've raised a lot of issues up here about corporate behavior, and we've heard one very important story from Lord Brown. Who would like to ask a question or raise a point? Normally at this point, incidentally, I should have planted 3 or 4 questions to make sure some hands go up. I have not done that, but fortunately a couple of hands did go up. Yes, sir. And just tell us who you are and which company you're from.
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
I'm Adam Bajer from LLP Group. We're an IT consultancy, and I did a lot of work for Lord Brown's company 15, 20 years ago, and I can assure him that it was a reasonable, kind, tolerant company, and it paid its bills on time as well, which was very nice. Now, I'm interested in something that Claudia said, because she mentioned that her company was able to twist the arm of a state in the United States. I think it's no mean feat. What is it that large corporates can do in the more difficult parts of the world, in which I know Lord Brown operates and Jean-Michel also mentioned? I think it's difficult in the case of something like TNK-BP to say that we will not invest in Russia unless you enact certain legislation that will give minorities greater freedom. What is the maximum that you can do to help, to be authentic, not just at the personal level, but also at the corporate level?
That is a really, really important and good question. Is it? And BP, I mean, Lord Brown, some of you may know, some of you won't, did a very big deal in Russia that actually earned billions for BP. It was like a money machine, really. It was huge. Enormous. So maybe Lord Brown first and then the others about dealing, because you're all global companies and not everywhere you're working is going to be as tolerant as everywhere else.
I start answers to all questions like this saying, the point about business is it's not perfect. And actually neither's the world. So we have to make changes where we can. My experience in Russia, and it finished before Putin changed the law, was that we actually had a reasonable number of openly gay people in TNK-BP. And actually within the group of companies owned by the investors in TNK, the Russian investors, they still have a large number of openly gay people working in Russia. But they have to be very careful. And herein, I think, lies the point that CEOs can do. CEOs have nudge power, as it were, to use a horrid phrase of today, but they can push things along, but they don't have any rule-making capability. They're not governments. But they can, and my experience is, with other areas like human rights, transparency, things like that, by the time you keep dripping onto a president or an administration, in some cases you can shift things along. Partly because people like to be a member of a club, and they like a bit of respect, and they figure out that they could give away something and they could become respected. And giving away a bit on LGBT might suit a government quite well. Secondly, you can do it by example. And I see, and it's very, if you've got an open company, you can send gay people to Russia, to Uganda and places, provided they're very aware that they can't break the law when they're there. But it makes a point that merit comes first, sexuality comes second.
So I had the privilege to talk to a group of corporate folks in London a couple of months ago, and I asked the question, what should we do as global corporate brands in places that are hard? The second question was, what are we willing to do? And the third question was how to operationalize it. As you might imagine, the answer to the first question and the second question were different. But what these companies were willing to do was to bring their brands together and create business roundtables in places that are hard, to have a dialogue in country, to educate straight allies in that country, to educate the country general manager in country, and begin to have dialogue with corporations who are clients of each other. Because if we're in India having a corporate roundtable on LGBT rights and make that known that there a handful of companies or dozens of companies coming together to discuss the topic, we begin to influence the dialogue. And very honestly, we're a whole lot more courageous in numbers, right, when we can bring our brands together. And this is a place where, even though we might compete with each other in the business world, we share best practices, and we're willing to go arm in arm in places in the world that are hard.
But do you ever get negative responses in those places?
So the answer so far is no. I'm sure there'll be a time when it's yes, but when we're hosting an event on a corporate campus, inviting our clients and other corporations to join us in the dialogue, and maybe we bring a minister in, maybe we bring some nonprofits in. I mean, the reality is there are three parts, right? The government, the citizens or the NGOs, the activists, and corporations, right? And if we can do that cross-sector dialogue, our experience to date has been that it's been positive and productive and respectful.
Jean-Michel.
I will take my hat of co-chair of Pride Sodexo, which is our group employee network, and say that we are dividing the world in two parts. One is the countries where it's okay to be gay, and it's 86% of our workforce, and the strategy is to be there on everything, have the network, have policies progressively. Then you have the 14% of the employees working in countries where they can be legally persecuted. Out of this 14%, 10% is India. And so we have 40,000 employees there. So India, we have started to work completely there with as an objective to have a network there. And then we have still 4% where our objective is to guarantee safety of people. That's the minimum standard that we can have. Guarantee safety means first providing the right level of information, and we are not good enough on that. So, for instance, in our international mobility policies, I think we are not clear enough. We must progress on that, and that's part of our objectives. So we have to take each case one by one. And I wanted to say something about the word allies, because we use it a lot in English. It doesn't translate into other languages. In French, we had to invent a new word. I asked the question for Czech. It doesn't exist. In German, it doesn't exist. So think about it. The word is not only English-speaking.
What's the word in French, then?
We invited hétérallié, which means heterosexual allié, because allié alone means World War II.
Right.
So that's not very friendly. So hétérallié. In Spanish, it's also heteroaliado, which is also a word we created, or heteraliada for a woman.
Right. Anybody want to, another question or another point, or maybe somebody wants to just compare to the Czech experience. You will have a lot of time, by the way, to talk about some of these issues in relation to the Czech Republic. But yes, please tell us who you are as well.
My name is Armin Boris. I'm from Clearstream here in Czech Republic, German. My question is, being gay and being a business leader and being in a board, you are as well invited from time to time to events in the evening. So there's cultural events where you are asked to bring your husband or your wife. Did you experience that after people discover that you're gay or lesbian, that you are receiving less invitations? And the second part of my question would be, what did you feel when you go there, how people are looking at you? So is there any big surprise? So, hello, this is my husband, or this is my spouse. How does this work? Yeah.
It's a very good question. Jean-Michel, you're straight, so you haven't got an experience related. You've got
nothing to share. I'm sorry.
Yeah. John, your experience was everybody knew by the time, so presumably...
And now, of course, I think I get the same number of invitations, if not more. And of course, I go with my male partner. Of course I do. That's to say, if he wants to come.
Not another boring old oil industry thing. Claudia.
So I've been very fortunate. Yeah, I'm married to a British wife, and she gets invited with me to corporate events, and have had no negative reaction whatsoever. IBM learned in the 80s, instead of saying bring your husband or wife, actually most of it said bring your wife, right? We started saying bring your adult guest, right? And people could bring their mother if they wanted, as long as the person was an adult. So that opened up the aperture for it to become just more ordinary to bring whomever you chose. And my wife is kind of like Lord Brown's partner. She may not want to come to some of these events, but I think people are respectful, and I think being ordinary, being natural, you know, introducing your partner or your wife or your husband, helps everybody else relax too.
I couldn't agree about that more, by the way. I think if you're relaxed, other people are more relaxed. If you're kind of tense about it, it's just so awkward for everybody. But I think the question is a good one, because actually that particular issue of, if you like, just social norms that presume, you know, there's an opposite sex partner, is sometimes the most awkward practical manifestation for people at work. Is, you know, there's an event where the partners are coming and it's, I haven't told them, and it can be the most awkward. It can be the first important reason just to tell everyone at the office what your life consists of. What your life consists of. Have you got an experience with this yourself, by the way? Tell us.
I was invited, I was married before, divorced, become gay, being openly gay, so not a big difference or problem. But some people did not recognize that and realize that. And I received here an invitation for a classical concert. And then the person who invited me said, we always wanted to invite you and your wife. I said, oh, sorry, I'm divorced, and by the way, this is my friend. And then you can see how the face was a little bit, oops, yeah. And then later on, he opted out to go for the dinner and said, it's better when you go alone, yeah. So I think it's really depending on which occasion, yeah. And I thought everybody knew, but there's always someone who doesn't know yet, and where this can create some kind of surprises. Let's say it like that, surprises.
I actually have to say, I think one of the advantages of gay marriage, legal gay marriage, is that actually it just makes some of these things a bit easier, because there's a kind of an established pattern that you're conforming to, and it does make it a bit easier. We'll take a question here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Frank Hoyer. I'm working here for British development company, Lordship, and I'm here since 24 years. My experience in terms of getting events or getting invitation for reception is that I'm totally open gay, and let's say for 90% all my business people or my business friends, they know that I'm gay, so there's no secret about that. And for example, I get sometimes invitations, for example, from the Dutch embassy, where it's written my name with husband. So even this is respected by, of course, some kind of business people. And also when I'm going to business receptions, they always know that I'm coming with my partner, so there's no problem at all. And what you discussed before, when you have, let's say, sending a CV or you have a first interview in a company, I never made, of course, I'm not saying in the interview or put on a CV that I'm gay or have a partner, but of course in some moment it comes in the company with colleagues and so on, yeah, where's your girlfriend and so on. And from the first moment I never made a big deal about that, and I always say I have a boyfriend or partner. Yeah, so, yeah.
Can be done, can be done. Okay, I'm just going to put another question to you each, and it's really about diversity. The kind of the diversity industry recognizes various categories: gender, sexuality, race, perhaps religion, and ethnic or national background. When we think of the advantages of diversity in a company, of having people with different minds, often it's not about these different categories where we put people. It'll be about having people who maybe are introverts and extroverts, or people who have mechanical brains as opposed to people with verbal skills, or people who are innately problem-solving and those who are innately, if you like, big picture, non-detail. I'm interested in whether you're interested, particularly Claudia, whether you're interested in that kind of diversity, or whether you see diversity as really about making sure that employees of different types are welcome in the company.
We see diversity on all the dimensions. That's why I said we recruit engineers and we recruit the business folks, and we want people who are old and young and who bring different experiences to the table. But where we see, I guess where we see the barriers are in the diversity aspects that we tend to categorize like female or a person of color or a different culture or LGBT. So not only do we want people to bring their engineering brain to work and their experience with you know, helping NASA get to the moon, but we also want them to bring their whole selves. And I think it's that last dimension of being able to bring your authentic self, whatever that is. It could be that I like horses, or I enjoy you know, sports, or I enjoy going to the theater, or I have a legal background as well as an MBA. Whatever all of me is what we want. So we don't want to just access, you know, the fact that I'm an accountant, right? We want to access the whole person. And I think that part of authenticity is what we're trying to deal with when we talk about the traditional diversity categories, because sometimes we block that person's brilliance because we don't give them a seat at the table.
That's a tough question, but a good one. The French law recognizes 20 criteria for discrimination, so you can continue. It's not only the traditional ones. And the answer may be to move from diversity to inclusion. And I think that's what all companies are doing progressively by learning, because when we start working on these things, we first need to focus on things that we can see or identify quite easily. Progressively, we realize that you cannot define yourself only by one dimension. I am a man, I am French, I am from my age, Gen Y, of course. It's a combination, but at the end of the day, it's how we, as an employer, include people for who they are, no matter where the point. I don't know the word in English, but that's the uniqueness of individuals that we have to recognize. But before getting there, so to this concept of inclusion, which means understanding our biases, we have to go through a learning process, a learning curve, which makes us defining, using words and putting people in some boxes. It's not the best, but it's the one we have to move to inclusion, which is the answer, I think.
To me, it's just another way of trying to capture different life experiences. You know, people may be a geologist or an economist, but actually based on their cultural, sexual, all sorts of background, they'll have a different take on things, probably. And I think that's really important as we move towards inclusion, because just occasionally you have a conversation about inclusion which goes into the mode of, oh, that's because everyone's going to be the same again. You know, it's not. It's actually, it's having a very broad room, a house with many rooms, you know, and having it in one house.
But you will find there are work environments, right, where there's a kind of, actually the army would be the best example of this, probably, where there is a kind of a camaraderie, a friendship, a bonding among the team, a really strong team spirit, and where the team, I suppose, wants people to fit in. They want to go out drinking, you know, or they want to go out doing something else. Now, do you discourage those teams from having that ethos in which we want our team to be, you know, we're bonding very strongly here. That means we're going to, you know, if you don't fit, you're not quite the person we want in our team. Is that a phenomenon?
So we would say, and in fact we use team sports to teach diversity, because we will ask generally white middle-aged men, what's your favorite team sport? And of course in the US they'll say American football, basketball, or baseball. In the UK they'll say proper football, right? In the Nordics they say hockey. In the Netherlands they say proper hockey, right? or field hockey. And I say to them, tell me, what's the most important person on that team? And they'll all, you know, it may be striker in football, it may be quarterback in American football. And I said, look, I'll give you a team of all quarterbacks or all strikers, but I'm going to take a team that has all the positions, all the diverse skills, that can play offense and defense. And we're going to play each other. And which of us is going to win? And the answer is always, oh, damn, Claudia, you're going to win. And I said, yeah, I'm going to win every time because I have that diversity of skill. And that's what makes the high-performance team, not the likeness of, you know, we all think the same, we all drink the same, we all look the same. It's that diversity of skill that creates the high-performance team. And all of a sudden, the light bulb goes on.
It's about purpose, and therefore how do you engage to the purpose. So, you know, the UK forces for 15 years have been having a big program of LGBT inclusion, and it's actually quite successful. They've got some very senior flag officers, you know, commanders out there, and it doesn't take away from the machine-like approach they need for the teams that they have doing certain duties.
So everyone can be aligned
to the purpose.
without all being the same.
Yeah,
Kind of the answer.
and back to the military example, I don't know if anybody's reading the press now, but there's a lot of attention in the U.S. about the first women going through the U.S. Army Ranger School, which is the top special forces, and this is the first time they've allowed women to do that. And they're still in the process, but there's still 2 women, you know, who've made it through, and it's about the same percent who's made it through, because they had fewer women start, but the same percent as the men who've made it through to this phase. And all of a sudden it goes back to purpose. They're going to be Army Rangers. It doesn't matter whether they're male or female. And oh, by the way, you know, our military were, you know, some of the first to really integrate the black and white, you know, in the U.S. And they became, again, more productive as they integrated and focused on purpose. It wasn't about being alike.
Okay, we're heading up towards coffee. I'm going to take one last question. I'll take David Pollard if there isn't another one. Yeah, David Pollard there.
Thank you, David Pollard, Director of Workplace Pride in Amsterdam. As a final shot, I'm sure that there's a lot of people in this room who work for Czech organizations who don't have the same level of leadership as we're seeing on the panel. My question to the panel is, what advice would you give to people who are either LGBT in their organization, maybe HR, going back to their Czech companies and taking the next step? What would that be from your standpoint?
question. Okay, a brief answer from each of you. Let's start with you, Jean-Michel.
First, share what they have heard today. That's what I did when I started, because when I started 8 years ago in France, there was no French company, if I'm right, having a clear commitment to LGBT inclusion in their D&I policies. So we had to take examples from outside of France. So we took IBM, we took some other companies, not that much, because very often those companies were active in their home country, not really in France. But I think it's very important. Second thing is to find people to talk with, and if possible, start with the top, because it's true we know that for any dimension of diversity, but without commitment from the top, nothing happens. But in this particular case, the place and the role of allies is absolutely critical. And actually, the way we've been quite successful so far is because of the involvement of straight allies first. Because to be honest, I had no personal network, being straight myself. So I was not able to go to offices and say, who is gay, by the way? So we gathered people, and progressively that's the way it starts small, 2, 3 people, 5 people. Next week I have a call with 5 people from Asia. Asia is quite big, but just 5 people. We start small, and I learned from EY that they have a network in Singapore. I will connect them locally. So that's, I think, a way to do it.
So the business case is something to take back from here that you'll have today from EY, from IBM, from others. The other thing to take back is if anybody does research on effective leadership, it includes things like authenticity and trust and working from those positions. So enabling your leaders, whether it's through engaging with a client who is further ahead and bringing them in to discuss with your senior executives. Because don't underestimate the power of straight allies, but also don't underestimate the power of the business case. So there is a business reason to do this. It's the right thing to do. Human rights are always the right thing to do. But there's a very powerful business case here, too.
I'd pick 2. Just I'd talk about engagement and why it makes a big difference. And I'd talk about role models, why it allows people to feel safe.
And if that fails, leave and go and work for a more enlightened employer. Now, we're going to stop for coffee for half an hour. You've time to mix, time to share experiences. When we come back, we're going to talk, actually, sort of drill down a little bit, to use an oil industry term, drill down a little bit into some of the actions, specific actions that companies can take. And you're also going to have a session specifically on the kind of the experiences you have and the problems you have and the opportunities you have in the Czech Republic specifically. We're not all just going to talk about the world. We will give you an hour on the Czech Republic. But we're going to have coffee for half an hour now. Enjoy that, chat among yourselves. When you come back, you're going to have 2.5 hours of non-stop session. So take a leak during the break, okay? But before you go, can we just thank our panel, who've been absolutely terrific and very articulate.